So as you can see, we record these breakfasts and, quote unquote Zoom breakfasts, right? And we do that so people that are unable to be here today can watch them in the future. So if you know someone that just couldn't be here this morning, this is going to be such a great program. We are going to be able to learn how to communicate in these difficult times, which I know I struggle with. It's really easy to communicate with my friends and family that are of like mind. But our neighbors next door who are Republican, we have actually a pretty good relationship with them, right? But we don't talk politics. We just avoid that subject altogether. It'd be nice to, and it was funny because one time I was talking to Donna and she said, oh, I used to be a Democrat. I used to vote that way. And I wish I would have had a better entry point to way to talk to her to get her to vote for the Democrats in 2020. So important, critical topic that we have today. And I want to thank the speakers ahead of time. We'll have Ellen introduce Ellen, sir, in just a bit. If you could please, unless you're asking a question or making a comment, if you can mute yourselves, that'd be great, because then those dogs barking and whatever coyotes howling in the background, we won't have to hear them also. I'm going to turn it over for just a second to Holly. Holly Pluk has been instrumental in making sure that we were all updated and coordinated on what's happening with the Independent Redistricting Commission. And so she's going to give us an update this morning. I caught you with breakfast, huh, Holly?
That's all right. Just finishing.
She's going to give us an update on what's happening.
Thank you, everybody. And thanks to all of the people on this phone. Although I don't see the fullest of participants, I know many of you were in attendance in Cottonwood on Tuesday night to give testimony or just to be there for moral support. And it was very well received. And thank you. I thought that our testimony was relevant, passionate, and we were able to look two commissioners in the eyes, one who was extremely important, and Shireen Lerner, who is a Democrat and represents the Democratic Party or the Democratic point of view, and the commissioner, the chairwoman, Erica Newberg, who is the swing vote pretty much. And so it was very important for her to be convinced by compelling testimony and by volume. And frankly, I have to say that we really hit the mark. I don't know how many people were there. Some people say 100, some people said 85, but we do know that we outnumbered the opposition at least 5-1. And that was really important because in Flagstaff, we didn't. And in Flagstaff, it was more like it was 50-50 in those who gave testimony in support of our premise and those who gave testimony in support of the Republicans. And basically, what we are trying to do is to have competitive districts in Northern Arizona so that any person can win and the best candidates run, and they have to win they have to win votes because they're rational, because they have a program that people support, a platform, and that they're accountable to the voters. Right now, that's not the case. Right now, if the maps stand as they are, those of us who live in West Sedona would be in LD5, and the village would be in LD5, which makeup is 28.5% voters, Republican advantage. And those of us who live in Coconino County would be in LD7, and that has a 29.8% Republican advantage. And Sedona would be split. And neither LD5 or LD7 would be with Flagstaff. So the districts are not competitive. They split Sedona, they split us away from Flagstaff, and it would be a disaster for the next 10 years. So we're working really hard. Tonight we have a training for presentations because the next opportunity to present is on Saturday in Prescott Valley, but you can always write the commission. I'll put the address in the chat, and they accept comments from the public 24/7, and they do read them. They mention them when they get together and they meet, and they will be holding hearings until December 4th, at which time they will be shutting down the hearings and going back to their own deliberations on the moving from draft maps to final maps. Their targeted goal for finishing their work is the end of December 21st, 22nd, somewhere in there. And then the next step would be litigation if anybody chooses to do that. So we have a very intense period right now. And we ask everybody to continue sending their comments in, even if you cut and paste your comment from today and put it in for tomorrow. It's still good. We have to bang that drum repeatedly over and over again until we can bang it no longer. Oh, thank you, Toby. Toby just put the contact information in the chat. I'd be glad to answer any questions, but I know we have a program we need to get to.
Isn't there a hearing tomorrow, Holly?
There is a hearing tomorrow.
Saturday, rather, I'm sorry.
No, it's I said we were having, no, there is a hearing tomorrow, actually. It's a town hall. And you know, from the last time we participated in a town hall, we spent the entire day before they got to Northern Arizona. So I'm encouraging people to go on Saturday to Prescott Valley instead. But you can go on the IRC website and see where the hearings are. But Prescott Valley is on Saturday at 10 o'clock at the Prescott Valley Library. And I know some of us will be going. And as I mentioned, we have a training tonight for those who are attending. Don't have to participate in the training to attend. You don't have to register in advance to attend. You can just show up and put your name on a list.
Thank you, Holly. Does anyone have questions for Holly? Okay, so Holly, did you want to put the link to the training or information in the chat for people?
I can do that.
Yeah, so if you can go, especially if you know someone from the Verde Valley other than Sedona, those are the people that they really need to hear strongly from, because they've heard from Sedona a lot, and they want to know that what we're saying other people in the Verde Valley agree with, which is true, but they have to hear it from them. So if you know anyone that you think would be willing to go over, you know, it's 2 minutes of your life. You know, for some people, for me, I get nervous during that 2 minutes, but that's okay. It's only 2 minutes and then it's done. And it's really critically important. You know, I have a little list of things to say at each of these breakfasts, but I don't have introducing myself, which I probably should. So my name is Kathy Rutherford, and I am President and Democrats of the Red Rocks. So I want to welcome everyone personally this morning. And Frankie, did you want to quickly tell them about the film club?
Sure. I think everybody, or maybe most people know, as well, some of you have attended our Democrats of the Red Rocks Political Film Club. I'm extending an open invitation. We meet once a month for an hour, Fridays, 5 to 6. We're meeting tomorrow, 5 to 6. Tomorrow, we are discussing the classic On the Waterfront. We watch new movies, old movies, foreign movies, American movies, documentaries, feature-length films. So this is a oldie but a goodie. This was mixed choice. We're very interested in talking about unions and workers' rights as well. Elia Kazan gave names during the Red Scare of McCarthyism, and so we want to also talk about what does camaraderie mean? What does loyalty mean? How do we negotiate our political selves? So it's a great time to have a conversation. You watch the movie before, and then you come, drink in hand, some snacks, and we have a delightful back and forth. So everyone is welcome.
Thanks, Frankie. And I did want to mention that our new website is now up. I don't know if any of you have been on it and more than a week ago or so. But our old website was being transferred to our new one, and it is now up, and the link is in the chat. Do you know, Shelley, if the film club is up there? Can they find that information on there? Okay.
Yeah, not the link. Frankie didn't want me to put the link on the website, but there's the email, there's the film club email where they can get the link.
Okay, so if you're interested in attending that film club tomorrow, just go on the website and you'll get the email and Frankie will send you the link. And that's once a month, and they do great discussions. It's a really cool group. So thanks so much for doing that, Frankie. I think that's a cool thing. I wanted to say we have a new program. It's called Friends of DORR, and everyone that's here, I'm sure, is a friend of DORR. And we have an ongoing need for sustaining donations. We have an office that it always exists. It's year-round, even on off election years, that help us keep our progress going. And it's been really important for all the IRC stuff and new people that come into town. And so please, if you just have a little bit every month, you can join Friends of DORR. You could do it for $10 a month or whatever you're comfortable with, and that will really help us to make sure that we can pay our bills each month. And you can share that information with other people too. That would be great. And I just want to mention to people that we will not have a breakfast Zoom program in December. That will be, everybody's going to be moving into the holiday season, and I want to wish everyone a wonderful, lovely holiday season, but we're not going to have a breakfast in December. So keep your eyes open for what's happening in January. That'll come out on emails. And if you're not on email, you can put your name in the chat, and we can, with your email, and Shelley will pick that up and get you on our email list. So that's it for all of the business part, and now we're going to start.
Kathy, could I, it's Toby, could I just say, because we're not meeting in December, just real quickly about requests to speak?
Oh yeah, totally.
Yeah, so we're going to begin requests to speak as soon as the legislature begins, and I don't have that date, but the reason I wanted to speak is to ask you, if you're not registered for a request to speak and you want to comment on the bills, pro and con on it, then you need to register, and I can help you do that. So I'm going to put the link in my email in the chat, and then just contact me, or if you have any other email for me, just contact me, and then I'll set you up with CEBV. They'll walk your request over there, and then you'll be ready to participate in request to speak in January. So thank you. Thanks, Kathy.
Kathy,
Yes.
I understand that Frankie also has a committee on letters to the editor for political purposes. Could she tell us about that just briefly?
Sure, but before we go back to Frankie, I just want to, define some of the lingo, because I've seen some people on the meeting today that I haven't seen before, and maybe you know all about it. But Request to Speak is an online program where you can actually comment on current bills that are going through our state legislature. It's a really easy process. There's all sorts of support, including training and support with which bills. There are people from Coconino County Democrats and from DORR looking at bills saying, okay, these are the really important ones to look at. And CEBV is a civic engagement beyond voting. There was a woman after the 2016 election, I think. She decided she had to do something, and she set this whole system up to support people doing that. So if you're interested in that, please, contact Toby, and she can get you set up for that. Frankie, you want to talk about letters to the editor?
Yeah, actually, hold on, I'm removing the spotlight from Toby here. Okay, actually, yeah, so we do have a letters to the editor group. We have encouraged folks to join the David Patchen group. They're very active. I think it's called the Name and Shame group. They're very active in their very clear letters concerning our political opponents. And that has been a very, very, very active group. And we're happy to connect you up with that. We do have a group, we have a Google Docs, and when people come forward with letters, we sort of help massage them. But the name and shame group is a much more active than, I'm getting so many emails from those guys. So they're very active. So if you're really into being in a supportive letter writing environment, I would suggest checking out that group. If you want some backup support, but don't sort of want this to be a major focus for you, then we're a good support network.
Okay, so you can put that info in the chat.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Will do.
And
Okay.
David happens to be on this phone call. So
Oh, perfect.
welcome, David.
Yes, welcome.
You're with us, Ellen.
Yes, I am. My internet is sketchy. It's going in and out, so I
I'll
apologize.
pick it up if you drop off. So I'm going to turn it over to Ellen, and she is the Democrats of the Red Rocks program chair, and she's going to start our program for us today. Thanks, Ellen.
Oh, you're more than welcome. This is a great program. I've been very excited about it for a long time. And obviously you have too, because this is a great turnout we have here this morning. In our notice, we talked about misinformation. And many of you remember Natalie Burdick from Felicia French's campaign. She got the notice and she wrote back to me and she said, misinformation is caused by errors or mistakes, like when you misspeak. What's happening now is disinformation, i.e. deliberately false content intended to manipulate public opinion, also known as lies and propaganda. So that quote from Natalie is actually very apropos to the things that our speaker is going to be talking about today. Speakers, both of them. They will talk about misinformation, whoops, or disinformation, which is really, really deceitful. Our first speaker is, and I should say both of these women are associated with Indivisible. And you know, there are two Indivisible groups here in town after the March Verde Valley and Indivisible Sedona. And we're very active, and Indivisible has grown tremendously since Trump was elected, and they have such fine staffers and do such fine work. So we're proud to be associated with them. Jody Rein is our first speaker. Jody was a publisher. She had her own publishing company. She was a literary agent and as a published author, editor, and national speaker. And then she became co-founder of something that Indivisible is sponsoring called the Truth Brigade. And it's a fascinating and so needed organization. And it's a growing group of people who seek the truth and seek to point it out and to point out the dis and misinformation. So one of the great things about doing these things on Zoom, I know it would be wonderful to meet in person, but Jody is in Colorado and we probably couldn't have her here with us today if we weren't on Zoom. So this is a real treat. So we'll hear from Jody and then I'll introduce Laura Turchik, who's also with Indivisible. Jody, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Ellen. Hello, everybody. I just love hearing all those doorbells ringing, all the people who are joining us this morning. I'm just really delighted to be here and to speak about the Truth Brigade. And I also wanted to clarify that I was in publishing, and I might have put the bio a little wrong. And then Trump got elected. And like so many of you, I decided to turn my life upside down and I changed careers entirely. And I was very fortunate to get hired by Indivisible about 3 years ago as an organizer. And I was the lead organizer in Colorado. I was your Trisha. I mean, Colorado's Trisha, and Trisha's a good friend of mine. If you don't know who Trisha is the lead organizer for Arizona. And while I was at Indivisible, I was always aware all the time of my passion for words and the importance of truth in words, so fighting disinformation as someone who's had a career of, expressing value for the written word, it was just such a natural progression for me to say, well, gee, what can we do at Indivisible to fight disinformation and to keep truth, to keep a a level of belief and a common sharing of the value of facts. And so about a year and a half ago, I co-founded the Indivisible Truth Brigade, which is a grassroots army, basically, of people across the country dedicated to fighting disinformation. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's cross fingers that that works, because I have a slideshow for y'all. Let's see. Oh, it worked. That's wonderful. Can everybody see and hear? I see nods. It's great. So this presentation is kind of it's a mix of two presentations. One is about disinformation and misinformation in general, and then I'm going to tell you all a lot more about the Truth Brigade. I'm going to speed through a little bit because there's a lot that I want to share with you. I'm not sure if we'll have time for questions, but if we don't, I just want to make sure everybody knows that I will be glad to make these slides available to everybody and to answer any questions that might come up afterwards. So, hello, Arizona. So the Truth Brigade, as I said, is all about combating disinformation. What we're going to talk about today in my little bit is I'm first going to talk about identifying the threat, and then how you can know what to look for in disinformation and misinformation, and then the good stuff. How do we fight back? And then, of course, telling you all about the Indivisible Truth Brigade. So we'll start with identifying the threat. And as Ellen said, there is a difference between disinformation and misinformation. Disinformation is done on purpose. It's all the nasty lies that you see. And I wondered if you might want to pop up some examples in the chat. So is there anything happening in Arizona right now that you can instantly identify as disinformation? What are people lying about? Let's take a minute and pop that in the chat. Really love to hear what you're faced with. So it may be the big lie about the election, where people who know that the election results were valid and are lying about it. The fraud, you bet. Yep. Oh, and very local. Verde Valley. Sham review the election. Yeah. Anything that you can think of where you know is a lie that's done on purpose, that's disinformation. And then misinformation, as Ellen said, that's false or misleading, but it's not purposefully created with intent to spread or to harm. However, misinformation is really, really important, because what happens out there in the world is that disinformation leads directly to misinformation. So you've got this pool, and it's actually a fairly small pool of ultra-right-wing folks who have a lot of experience, a lot of power, a lot of expertise. They create the lies, spread the lies, and then you have the millions of people who are amplifying the lies unknowingly, right? They're being convinced that it's true, but then they're sharing misinformation. They don't want to harm you necessarily. They think they're doing you they think they're doing a favor, right? They're giving you the last anti-vaccine information because they think it's going to help you, but it's still misinformation. It's still harmful. So how do you look for it? How do you find the core disinformation? The right, as I said, has a huge infrastructure online to move the same content across hundreds of pages. Again, important thing to remember is that it's not like a network of thousands and thousands of minded people. This is a relatively small group of very powerful organizations, things like the Daily Wire, things like Breitbart News, and 10 or 12 other places that are moving the same content online across hundreds of pages. So this is coordinated, and you can see how the major far-right outlets will share the same stories. And then you can see what happens is that unofficial or connected pages follow suit. So they take the stories that were created by these organizations that I mentioned, and then other people start to reprint that same disinformation. And then the more it gets reprinted, the more it starts to look like news, or starts to look like facts to the unsuspecting people who are regular people. So they post over and over across platforms. Another important thing about, I can't do it today, but if anybody's interested, we put a great presentation together on the psychology of disinformation. Why is it that people spread lies? What is it that sticks in their brains? And one of the things that sticks is that people perceive as true things they see more often. And so because these platforms share the same things again and again, then the average person after a while starts to believe it's true just because of repetition. So as I mentioned, so bad actors will push the same information across multiple platforms. And you can see some examples here. I know this is a little too small to see, but again, I'll share these slides. And then what happens, of course, is the same disinformation gets localized. And so then the disinformers, they want to appear like they're your friendly neighbor. And so you might see something in your local next door. You might see a lot in local Facebook pages. The more localized it is, again, that kind of tricks people into believing it, because we tend to believe things that come from people that we know and trust. And I'll say more about that in a moment. There's a good flip side to all of this too, by the way. So this is the disinformation, but soon we'll get to how we fight it. And then it's not just the repetition or the coordination, it's also the fact that these become sustained conversations over time. So that gives the appearance that a narrative is salient, even if it may not be. I wonder if anybody can think of an example right now in the news that, or not in the news, in the atmosphere that's based on an entire falsehood and is everywhere. See, CRT, you got it, Laura. That's exactly right. This whole critical race theory garbage. It's a fake conversation based on nothing, as I'm sure you all know, and yet it's permeated the entire right-wing rhetoric and is going to be used in the midterm elections to, get people outraged. Outraged about what? About something that doesn't even really exist in our life. I'm not going to go on a whole CRT spiel. I could another time if you like, but yes, it's a perfect example. So how do we fight back? So, well, the answer to combating toxic disinformation is us. So this is the good news. So as much as I've been talking about this manufactured disinformation that we see out there, human beings are most persuaded by other human beings, and that's especially people that they know and trust. We know this is true in canvassing. I mean, you're a democratic organization, you know about the deep organizing and relational organizing that you all work so hard to do. And it's the same thing is true with disinformation. People go to, I have some friends who are doctors, and they are able to persuade people about the COVID vaccine because they're already trusted sources. It's the same thing. We can persuade people one person at a time, even though there's all these giant bots and bad actors out there, we can make a difference. And then disinformation tends to erode trust, but our consistent messaging over time can build trust back up. And building trust up in a civil society and in a basic respect for researched facts, that's what our whole country needs to be based on. The more we can increase trust, the more we can create an environment where good legislation can pass. It's really the purpose of all this misinformation and disinformation spreading is at heart to disrupt democracy and to sorry, my cat is pushing me on my, if you see a little black face, that's my cat pushing on the keyboard. But anyway, the purpose of disinformation is sadly to overturn our democracy, because if people don't trust in the government and they don't trust in democracy, then they can't have democracy, and we can't pass the work that protects people. And that's, of course, the sad part about the spreading of disinformation, is that the ultimate result is a worse society and an unfair society and an inequitable society. Our good news is that it doesn't take a lot of us to make a big difference, but the more of us that are out there sharing our same positive and factual messages, the more the exponential power we'll have. So how do we do it? If we're talking about fighting disinformation online, what we need to look at is influencing the algorithms. And so what the algorithms mean is, I'm talking about Facebook and Twitter specifically right now, although the Truth Brigade also fights disinformation offline. I want to make that clear. Our project works both online and offline. But online, what you see in your news feed is based on how many people are engaging. And so the more we can get people to share our positive information, obviously the more successful we'll be, but also the more we can disrupt the sharing of disinformation, the more successful we'll be. So what we want to try to do is lower the views of the people who are sharing the bad information while upping the views of the people who are sharing the good information. So how do we start? So our number one strategy, and I'll be talking about this more a little bit later, is never, never, never amplify a false claim, not even to debunk it. So just have you sit with that for a minute, because I'm sure it's just so easy to want to get online and to prove that someone is wrong by showing a counterfact. Well, it doesn't work, because the more you engage in an argument online, the more the Facebook and the Twitter and the other online entities, the more their algorithms say, aha, this is popular, so let's keep it rising to the top. So if there's one thing I can leave you with, the most important thing you can do, never click, comment, share anything in an online that's in an online platform. If you just do that, you can make a big difference. It's kind of crazy. So here's our other great news, and this is something that we've just learned over the last week, is that we can influence critical thought. So it turns out that online, 84%, can you believe this? 84% of disinformation is shared by accident. Isn't that crazy? People are just clicking through. They're not really knowing what content they're sharing. This was, and I'll be glad to share this study with you. It's this amazing study. As I said, we just learned about it last week. So much disinformation is shared by accident. And not only that, but in this study, they showed that just one message that encouraged critical thought, it increases the discernment by 15%. Isn't that? I don't know. I was just so delighted to see this. So I hope that that makes sense. And so for 84% of the people are sharing disinformation by accident, you know, just because they think that something's true or they're not reading it all the way through. You send them one message that encourages critical thinking, and you can reduce the sharing of those messages by 15%. I don't know, I was so excited to see that. So what do? So we have to activate our networks, because once we convince our networks about the disinformation, then we can beat the bad guys at their own game. So now I'm going to tell you about the Truth Brigade. So the Truth Brigade is right now it's about 4,500 people have signed up across the country, and we fight the disinformation. We fight it with some very carefully calculated strategies. So this isn't just throwing messages back out there into the environment without thought, but basically we're harnessing grassroots power to counter this disinformation and to build back the trust that's a foundation of a civil society. So how we do this is through effective engagement. We're not trolling. We're not pretending to be organized. We're reaching out to each other human to human. And above all, we are authentic. So here's our big picture tactics. We want to decrease the specific disinformation's prominence on social news feeds. So I hope that makes sense. So basically what we want to do is make sure that there's less disinformation that's appearing out there. And then we increase critical thought online and offline, and then we grow. Those are our big picture tactics. So for the Indivisible Truth Brigade basics, people join the Truth Brigade by signing up, and then twice a month, we personalize and share messages online and offline. These are short messages that I say are very carefully designed to counter the most damaging and timely and specific disinformation. The messages are usually just a few sentences long. They're in the frame of what we call a truth sandwich. And then the message always include the same hashtag, which is Truth Brigade on Twitter. And the campaign messages that we run always have explainers. And so I'll be glad to share those with you, after this call, but so that you know exactly what you're doing and why. So as I said, they're framed as truth sandwiches, which means that we start with sharing common ground. Then we prompt critical thinking, which is questioning the motives of the messenger. And then we close with a truthful action or emotion. You'll notice what's not in there is fighting the disinformation directly, because that doesn't get us anywhere. that's the, the point of the Truth Brigade is not to shout at people. It's not to argue with people. It's to provide something that makes people really think about, okay, I agree with that. So maybe the place that I'm getting the message isn't the right place. Here's an example of a truth sandwich. So if you join the Truth Brigade, basically what you're doing is you're sharing a short message like this online and offline twice a month. And that's what the Truth Brigade does. And then we have a communication system. We talk with each other on Slack, in email, and then we, as I said, we have team calls the second and fourth Wednesday of each month. And we're really making a difference. You can see we have 159 million views of our online messaging. We've been written up in Forbes, in Axios, in the Washington Post. And the thing that really kind of grabs me about this whole system is that there's kind of a secret sauce to the whole thing. And that is, as I said, the Truth Brigade is not about shouting facts against facts, because we don't really get anywhere by saying, oh, no, you're wrong about that. You're wrong about this. It's what we do is we encourage, as I say, the critical thinking for everyone, so that it doesn't just stop a single disinformation campaign, but it actually encourages people to continue to think critically beyond the initial bad message that we're trying to counter. And so when you have close to 5,000 of people learning best practices and countering disinformation, that means 50 million people are not seeing the bad content that's being clicked. Our philosophy also reduces offline arguments, again, because we're not fighting fact for fact. We're trying to encourage that critical thought. And in the end, we're actually promoting positivity, which is kind of a crazy thing in this world of disinformation and lies. But again, it's because that's what we found is effective, is questioning, is finding the message that actually encourages the critical thinking rather than fighting back. You can't fight lies with facts. It just doesn't work. So that's our secret sauce. And our current campaign right now is about deplatforming climate disinformation. We ran that campaign because the, I think it's called the COP, I'm spacing out right now, and I think it's COP26. Does anybody know the climate conference that just ended in Scotland? No? Anyway, I'm looking to see if the chat is on. Anyway, so our current campaign is all about climate. And I'll be glad to share that with you after this presentation so that you can join in. And if you want to get involved, I kept this little GIF on there from last year, but we're almost at the holidays. You can join individually if you want to join up with Truth Brigade. You can form your own Truth Brigade team. You can have group message writing parties, and you can also use our tactics locally. So I think that's the end. I don't know, do we have time for, yeah, COP26. Do we have time for questions?
Yes, we do.
Great. And I'll stop my share.
Jody, I love your quote, "You can't fight lies with facts."
It's crazy, right? But you can't argue. You have to find that shared vision and then kind of expand on that. And you know what, I think it might be helpful if I can come up with some more examples of what some Truth Brigade campaigns are like. So I can take a look while people are, if you have any, does anybody have any questions around this? If not, I can see if I can.
Hi, I don't know if you can hear me, but.
Yeah, I hear you.
Okay, is this in written form somewhere? If it's in writing, I can refer back to it and kind of refresh my thinking.
Yeah, you know what? Let me dig up the actual campaign that I mentioned, and I'll put a link to it so that you can all see what I'm talking about exactly. And I think that will be helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I think a lot of people, Jody, are afraid to post things, especially on their personal Twitter or personal Facebook, because they don't want to alienate people. They're afraid of getting into a contentious argument.
Mm-hmm.
And so it makes it hard for the average person to just put a statement out there knowing that their brother-in-law is going to come back with some piece of, some misinformation or disinformation.
Mhm.
So you have to be pretty bold to do this on a personal level, I think.
I would say I would kind of push back against that a little bit, because first of all, if you're in a private Facebook group, you can still share the messages within that safe community. And then the people who are feeling a little more bold can share those messages then from your private group out into the world. You can provide a link to, well, contact me if you want to have this in a form that you can share to the rest. So there are people, once you put it in your private group, then people can then, if they're comfortable, share it out on their own Facebook feed, to share it out on their Twitter account. So that's one thing I would say. Another thing is that our messages, we've been doing this now a year and a half, and we have never had a bad actor come and invade our calls. We have, I would say, we constantly monitor social media and all of the things that we post to see if there are any bad actors who are sort of co-opting the messages or, posting nasty stuff. We have never had to cut anybody off so far. This is a year and a half. And I know that sounds crazy, but we do monitor it really closely. And I think that's because we're not engaging on the nasty posts. So if someone is online and they're saying something that's wrong, we're not telling you to post on that post, because all that does, as I said, is amplify that post. We're saying create a parallel post on your own account with your own arguments so that you're convincing people who are already following you. You're not trying to fight in their area, in their territory. So that probably prevents a lot of that nastiness that you can see. A really important thing I think to keep in mind is that, as I mentioned before, we found, this recent MIT study that shows that 83% or 84% of disinformation and misinformation that is shared is inadvertent. So what does that mean? Well, that means that there are a lot of people with good intentions who are within our trusted communities who are still spreading misinformation and disinformation. So if all we're doing is reaching our trusted communities and helping give them the language to discuss these issues in a way that doesn't trigger fights, but does spread the facts, then we're doing a huge service, right? We're reducing the amount of misinformation and disinformation by 15% just by correcting things within our own networks. So yeah, I think you can get involved with the Truth Brigade and do an awful lot of good and stay safe, because you're not posting out there into this ugly, nasty world. And I guess the other thing I should say about that is that we all know, you guys are the Democratic Party, and you know that when you're doing your canvassing and your phone calls and everything, that you have an audience that you select. You're not trying to convince the far right people to suddenly vote Democratic, right? You have your persuasion curve, and you're trying to convince the people who are on the edges of the curve. And that's the same thing with the Truth Brigade. We're not trying to change the minds of the far right people. That's really not going to happen. We're really just trying to provide to gently but effectively counter the disinformation and disrupt the disinformation chain that's out there among persuadable people.
Right.
And a 15% margin makes a big difference.
We have 3 hands in the air. Marilyn, do you want to go first?
Thank you, Ellen, and thank you, Jody, for a great presentation. It occurs to me that it might be the smart move for those of us who want to get into this regularly to develop, well, of course, our Twitter handles don't necessarily have our names on them, but to develop second Facebook and Twitter accounts that we don't include our regular group in, and so that we are not identifiable as your neighbor or your League of Women Voters friend when we make these responses. It's a little bit of a sidetrack to what you were saying, but it's another way of avoiding getting into trouble with that.
Right. Good point. good point. The name and shame group that David Patchen runs for Indivisible gives lots of good information like that. And I would encourage people that would like to speak out, but maybe are afraid or just want to get their facts right to join this group. You can speak to me or to Marilyn, and we can definitely hook you up with that. But yeah, that's a good point. Frankie?
Yes, Jody, thanks. That was really a really interesting presentation. So I'm wondering, how do you think about this in a face-to-face context? So yeah, and how does your understanding of social media translate when you encounter folks that are spreading or who have been the recipient of disinformation?
It's the same kind of tactic. I think, I was trying to remember if I talked about the slide on the promotion of positivity, but I kind of want to lean into that a little bit, because one of the really unexpected outcomes of the Truth Brigade is the more we study the science of communication and of persuasion, the more we realize that the art of persuasion really lies in empathy, right? And that even when you're talking about, and again, I'm not talking about trying to, there are people who you're not going to be able to persuade to do anything, and all you can do with those people is try to, if there's a relationship there, is try to maintain it. And so my philosophy around that is, I'm not even trying in any way to persuade people who are they're just not persuadable, but I do want to maintain those relationships in the hope that eventually, if we become in a less polarized environment, then we'll be able to have conversations again. But with the people who are persuadable, or at least open in person, again, it's the same kind of philosophy as any relational organizing work that you might do, which is empathetic listening. You find points of commonality, find shared values, and then you can gently sort of lean into a place where your shared values might take you to a different place, more toward your place. So for example, you have someone who is just, passionately anti-vax, right? And they're anti-vax because they've been convinced by people that they trust and enough repetition that there are dangers in the vaccination. With those kind of people, you can start a conversation. There's definitely, I'm sure everyone on this call has the same point of commonality, which is that we can't know everything about the vaccines, right? We would all agree. I think one of the main differences is that people on this call see things that come up and shifting advice on vaccinations. We see that and understand that fits in the context of the larger view of millions and millions of people who have had successful experiences with vaccinations and a history. So we put into that context. The people on the other side are putting into the context of, oh my God, I don't trust anything. I don't trust government. Everybody's out to get, so that's their mindset. So you find that point of commonality of, yeah, I can see that I get confused by the information too. What I found helpful is talking to my doctor, so maybe you might find that helpful. So that's in an offline conversation. That's sort of what I always would keep in mind. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
And I think all of us run into those conversations, and we'll have more of them as we move towards the holidays. So yeah, thanks. For all of us.
Michelle?
Yeah, I had the same thought as Ellen, is that, I think we all have to make decisions about whether we want, for example, our Facebook feed to be political or not. And I have a gentleman in my former neighborhood, and he just posts beautiful pictures of flowers or, trees or whatever. And many people comment that that's very refreshing, because we are sort of bombarded by everybody's comments on the world. And I would not be posting. I would not be making political comments, because I think it's one thing to identify in a group as, here's how I feel about something. A group like this, it's another to let's be posting it all over the internet for everybody to share and do. So I really think people have to be careful with what they're posting and how that's interpreted and so on. We had one family member, I had to just unfollow her. It was so disturbing. But I think, and I get it, some of you have said, I lost friends and that's okay, but how far do you take it is the question. And everybody has to make their own decision.
I think that's a great point, because whenever you're doing anything online, you do have to think about where you're posting and what people want to hear. You can't just come out there and just suddenly start blasting any kind of opinion, even if it's gently presented. I think we all have to be empathetic about the environment in which we're sharing information. And one of the suggestions that we often make is just, if you're in a Facebook group, for example, let's say you're in a book club and you kind of think that everybody thinks the same way, but you're not sure. And let's say there's something you feel is really important, life-saving, whatever it is, and you want to share some information about it. You can always ask the administrator first before posting, just test the waters and make sure that the environment you're posting into is one that's open to the things you want to say. With the Truth Brigade, one of the important things is that the messages that we share are not, we do not want people to share them verbatim. That would be sort of exactly what we don't want people to do. We want you to take the basic structure, of share the truth, prompt critical thought in the listener, however that works, and then share the truth again. That's a truth sandwich. We want you to do that, but within those parameters, you write in the way that makes sense for you personally, because the authenticity of the messages is what really matters. So I would say use caution. You can still use these techniques without coming out on a bandstand and trying to convince everybody of everything. That's really the most important thing about it, is that you're learning these strategies, but then you're using them in the environment where you're the most comfortable, where you think it will be welcome, and not starting arguments, because we don't get anywhere with arguing. Isn't that bizarre to think, we're not gonna win in an argument, in a world of arguments. We're gonna win with gentle persuasion and facts and empathy.
That's great, and I agree with you. The After the March group, it's our local Indivisible group. We started a Facebook page, and it was private, and it was a safe space that we could say things to each other, and we could blast Trump and feel comfortable that what was in there stayed in there. Because if it's a private page, your words won't get out. However, we found that you can't share things on a private page. So if we had really clever memes or things that we really liked and we wanted to enable other people to share them, we opened a second group, which is called After the March Public. And that makes it very clear, this is a public page and you do have the option to share something. And so that was how we handled that locally. Now, of course, whatever you write, I mean, there's nothing to stop somebody from doing screen share, a screensaver or whatever you call it, when you take a picture of the screen and then saying, look what she said. But we screen whoever is in the group. We don't allow just everybody in. And so we do feel like it's private.
Yeah, I just start to think about your own networks. Most of the people who've done survey of the Truth Brigade members, and most of the people's networks tend to be about, I would say about 70% like-minded people, but then there's 20 to 30% of people who are kind of on the edges. And these are the people, if they haven't dropped off, because in so many of our networks they're getting narrower and narrower. But these are people who might be persuadable even within your own networks. And then if you persuade them to think, this MIT study is just amazing. I'll share it with everybody afterwards, but it showed that, as I said at the beginning, people who were posting misinformation and disinformation, they were sent one message suggesting that they check the accuracy of the source, and 15% of those people stopped sharing the inaccurate information. So there was no, nobody standing in a soapbox or anything. There was just like, okay, here's, check the accuracy of the source. So that's kind of amazing, the impact that we could have.
People back down.
Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jody. If people have more questions for Jody, please put them in the chat. I hope you will stick around to listen to our second speaker, Laura Tarek. Laura and Jody, we appreciate all that you've said. That was terrific and chock full of information. And I just see that our mayor was here on the call, and she said she found it a very valuable presentation, and she will watch the rest later because we do have this will be posted on the DORR YouTube channel. Laura Tarek was in Sedona last week with a bunch of others from Civic Engagement Beyond Voting. Civic Engagement Beyond Voting, for those of you who don't know, is an indivisible group, much like ours, and they have done an amazing job, phenomenal work, promoting requests to speak, the Iyer report. We've had Melinda Iyer and Kathy Sigmund on these breakfasts before. They come out with the Iyer report every week when the state legislature is in session, and then we can comment based on the information that they're providing us. And that was what we were talking earlier about, the request to speak. Well, Laura was an elementary school teacher, and then also decided that she needed to have a greater impact, I guess. And so she joined Indivisible as a community organizer and as an advocacy consultant. And so she spends a lot of time on request to speak, and she works on federal and local campaigns. And we're lucky to have her here in Phoenix so that she's part of Arizona Indivisible. She is a specialist in communications, and someday we're hoping she will run for the state legislature. At least that's in the plan. That's on her list. So she's a very ambitious and smart, wonderful person. We loved meeting you last week at Vino di Sedona, Laura. So welcome to the Democrats of the Red Rock breakfast.
Well, thank you. It is so nice to be here and see so many familiar faces. So when Ellen and I were talking about this, she said, "Oh, do you care if you go first or second?" And I said, "Oh, whatever, I'll go second in case I need to pull anything out, change things." And I'm so glad I did, because my presentation is focused really specifically, now that we have all the information about combating mis and disinformation, I'm going to focus really specifically on messaging and how we talk about these things in a way that's going to be most effective. So if I could have screen sharing abilities, I would love to be able to.
Can you make Laura a co-host?
You should be able to share now. Oh, wait, now.
Yeah, should be.
Perfect. Here we go. So I am from Civic Engagement Beyond Voting, which is an indivisible group. And this is part of our Changing the Conversation series focused specifically on messaging. So here's what we'll cover today: targeting by audience, how to take back public discourse, the Overton window, deep dive into messaging, and then time for Q&A at the end. So there's a lot of information here, but I just want to let you know that you'll be able to access these slides at any time in our Civic Engagement Beyond Voting letters to the editor hub, and I will put all that information in the chat at the end. Now, as we're going through the presentation, I'd like you to think about how you can message some of these really tough topics, whether that's face-to-face, in a letter to the editor, or on social media, because this will cover sort of all of the above. So let's start with targeting by audience. And this may be more specifically for letters to the editor or maybe a social media post. I think that you would do this less while you're in person, but it's kind of helpful to sort of shift our framing in who we're talking to and why. So who are you trying to reach? Well, let's say you want to reach people who agree with you. Great. My next question is why? Why, if you're spending time talking with people who already agree with you, there should be a very, very specific purpose there. And that purpose would be to inform about an issue that perhaps they don't know about and give a very specific call to action. And this is the only column that I would say it's okay to have a maybe more pointed tone, a tone that's a little more heated, or I don't want to say aggressive, but that can veer into those really, really, really strong emotions on a topic that we all agree on, or that you're talking with someone who does feel that way. But if you're trying to reach people who are undecided, and Jody mentioned that with that persuasion curve, again, same question, why? Why are we trying to reach those people? Well, we want to inform them and persuade. So to do that, we really want to meet them where they are and connect on shared values. And remember that their issues might not be your issues. And a great example of this is a bill that J.D. Mesnard attempted to pass this year on voter ID. So what he was proposing is that people would need to photocopy their driver's license and include that along with their mail-in ballot. Now, for working families, that's a burden. I mean, if you don't have a printer at home, which many people don't, or if you're like me, you have about 3 printers and none of them work, then you're needing to, drive somewhere, go to Kinko's, get a photocopy of it. Maybe you don't have reliable transportation or you're working several jobs. When are you going to go and do that? That's a pretty heavy burden. For J.D. Mesnard's district, about half of his entire district is made up of Sun Lakes, which is a retirement community. That argument doesn't land as much. I mean, it makes some dent, but not as much as highlighting the fact that this is a really huge privacy concern. I mean, that's a lot of personal information to be putting into your ballot, and it could even incentivize ballot theft. So that was a much more successful message against that particular bill than talking about the burden on working families. So I just always highlight that as their issues might not be your issues, but there's still a way to do that, inform and persuade. Now, if we're trying to reach people who don't agree with me, again, same question, why? Well, to change their minds. And a lot of us, and I think especially after the 2016 election, there was so much, so many heated emotions. We were kind of coming at this very, very hot and no, you're wrong and this and that. And it's exactly what our previous speaker talked about. Facts sometimes just don't matter here. That's not the way we're going to do this. So when we're talking about changing people's minds, that's inform and persuade. So just move right back over into that purple column and use the undecided techniques rather than coming at this from a no, you're wrong, I'm right point of view. Now, in general, I tend to stick right in the middle for almost all of my messaging, because the bonus is the people who already agree with you, you're going to bring them along anyway. So the only reason to really go after that pointed tone, the people who agree with you, is if you're looking for a very specific call to action. So let's talk about George Lakov's How to Take Back Public Discourse. So I'm going to go over a few of his tips. This is an outstanding, he's an outstanding person. He is a cognitive linguist and philosopher. He was a professor at UC Berkeley. And he titled his book, Don't Think of an Elephant. And the reason he gave his book that title is because when you hear don't think of an elephant, our brains immediately start picturing an elephant, what they look like, what they, where they live, how they sound, etc. So we want to set the terms of our own debate using clear, compelling language. We don't need to be boxed into a corner based on the other side's messaging. And a great example of this is Nixon. When he's saying, I am not a crook, your brain immediately, well, but are you, are you sure? That's, that's an example of a very unsuccessful frame because he's using that other side's language, and it obviously stuck with him. So here are some of those tips. Remember, don't think of an elephant. So if you're keeping their message and their framing to argue against it, you're reinforcing their message. As Jody mentioned, you're simply amplifying what they're already saying. Whether you're arguing against it or not, even the fact that it's out there still is perpetuating that message. So we must do more than speak truth to power. We need to frame these truths effectively and highlight our perspective. And I'm going to tie that to the next one, which is to speak from your moral perspective. Use the language of values. We want to leave the policy language at the door. And the other benefit to this is that when you lead with values, you're making it harder for someone to argue with you on that specifically. So if I say, I believe that as an American, one of our strongest values is freedom and justice for all. That's something I believe that I'm saying is important to me. Someone has a very hard time coming back to that and saying, no, you don't. That's not true. Well, yes, it is. It's my belief. Those are my values that I see for all of us. I'm not going to necessarily talk about policy in that moment because that's where you can really get into the nitty-gritty of things. It can be less helpful. It is also very important to understand where the other side is coming from. So know what you're arguing against. Try to predict what someone in the opposition might say. That will help you prepare a little bit better. And then think strategically across broad areas. This is bigger than just one program or one policy. So when we're talking about, for example, education funding, yes, that's about our schools, but it's also about our state's economy. It's about the kind of environment we want to live in and our long-term future. All of these things are very tied together. We want to broaden it as much as possible. Voters vote their identity and their values, and this does not always align with their self-interest. I think we see that in terms of polling in the non-educated or non-college educated white voters tend to vote Republican, even though economically the policies that the Democrats propose might benefit them a little bit more. People vote their values, not necessarily something that would always align with what they believe in or what would be best for them. And then we want to be proactive, not reactive. So practice your framing by playing offense instead of defense. And with this, with all of the things that we're doing with messaging, with what we see in the media, we're bumping up against something called the Overton Window, which is what we'll focus on next. And if you haven't heard of that, I have a short little video that will explain what this is. And this is something that always exists in public discourse and is always shifting. So it's very fascinating to think about the Overton Window and where it is on some of these big hot topics that we're seeing now, like voting, critical race theory, school funding, things like that. So let's see if this will play for us. Sometimes it's a bit tricky.
The Overton Window is a model of policy change, and the Overton Window describes one big thing. Ideas that are inside the Overton Window are ideas that are politically safe. The public is ready to accept them. But ideas that are outside the Overton Window are ideas that might be too radical for the public to accept. And any politician who supports ideas that are outside the Overton Window today risks finding himself getting defeated in the next election. Anything that changes the public's perception of an idea can shift the Overton Window. Things like think tanks, the media, entertainment, the crisis, or historical events. Anything that gets the idea out of the open so that it can be discussed and debated has the potential to shift the window. The Overton Window doesn't always move in just one direction. For a public policy on alcohol, for example, we have the Overton Window moving toward less freedom when prohibition was enacted. The consumption of alcohol was made illegal because the public was fed up with the social problems caused by very high alcohol consumption back in those days. When people saw the effects of prohibition, however, they decided that the law that they thought they wanted, they weren't too happy with. And so the Overton Window shifted back and prohibition was repealed. So the pro-prohibition forces overshot the Overton Window. Policies where the window is shifted toward more freedom would be women's suffrage. Clearly, that's an area of more freedom today than it was 100 years ago. And in an even shorter period of time, many of citizens' rights regarding firearms have shifted in the direction of more freedom. There's a common misperception about the Overton Window, and that is that politicians themselves move the Overton Window. That's backwards. What politicians are good at is detecting where the Overton Window is and reacting to it at any point in time. The Overton Window cannot tell you if a policy is good or bad. What the Overton Window does is tell you what policies are on the verge of possibility. Ideas that are near the edge of the Overton Window, but just outside of it, may be tomorrow's policy reality.
So we want to do what we can to shift that Overton window and get some of those policies that we support within the realm of possibility. And one of our strongest ways to do that is messaging. So let's take a deep dive now into messaging. So the first thing you want to do is establish yourself as a trusted messenger. And I put specific, we'll have general next. So according to recent Gallup polls, these are among the most trusted professions, not necessarily all of them, but it's among them. So if your job is relevant to what you're talking about, you're a small business owner, you're a teacher, you're a firefighter, and it's something having to do with that, definitely say that. I mean, it's something that I try to mention really early, whether I'm talking to a voter, writing a letter to the editor, etc. So when I canvass, when I knock on a door, I introduce myself by saying, hi, I'm Laura. I'm a teacher volunteering for so-and-so today, because I want them to know three things really quickly: my name, the fact that I'm a teacher, and I want to establish the fact that no one is paying me to be there. I'm doing this on my own time. But you can also come at that from a general standpoint as well. So mother, father, grandparent, etc., longtime Arizona resident, community member, citizen, and probably my favorite, neighbor. Now, when you actually start talking with someone, it's important that we're using language that is the most effective. And the kind of all of the messaging examples that I'm about to give are really focused on voting, because I believe it's so important. Right now, we're seeing such an attack on voting rights. It's the sauce that makes everything else, right? But these will be applicable to a lot of broad topic areas. So I want to highlight some replace and embrace language. And this comes from these partners that you see up on here. They have Democracy Rising briefings every Wednesday, and I will put the link in the chat at the end because they're really helpful. I would encourage everyone to attend those. So let's look at replace and embrace number one, and then we'll go to number two. And again, all of these slides will be available to you at the end. So we want to replace election security and election integrity with what you see on the embrace column on the right-hand side, safe and accessible elections for all. So while voters register agreements with messages that try to reclaim election security and integrity for our side, research shows that this approach actually backfires by increasing support for anti-voter policies. The phrase election security evokes a conservative law enforcement frame that feeds our opposition's narrative. So election security, election integrity, which the right has increasingly been utilizing, they've become these really frozen phrases associated with fraud, and they move our audience to a fear-based mindset that demands these restrictive, punitive measures and shuts them off from other solutions. Similar thing with voting rights. That's the one that I say all the time. I'm still trying to kind of shift over to some of those embrace language, but freedom to vote is a really strong frame because it garners support and intensity across all measures. Safety, especially in our present context, was deeply resonant with people, but we want to individualize the idea of voting as your personal right. This is my right to vote. Voting rights, the reason that it's not as successful is because it renders it as kind of an abstract and process-oriented thing rather than something that's very tangible and personal to you. And then finally, on the bottom column there, democracy reform, fix our democracy, restore democracy. We want to leave all those behind and switch to fair representation and making the promise of democracy real for us all. Democracy reform is just a non-starter among a lot of voters who rank it last in a very broad list of priorities because we generally use the term reform to describe something undesirable rather than creating something good. So this risks casting aspersions on democracy itself, furthering the right-wing project of impugning democracy as a form of government. Democracy reform, along with phrases like fix our democracy, also suggests that our democracy has been fully established in the US as opposed to being an ideal that we are always trying to reach, we are always trying to be better at. So let's look at the second set here of replace and embrace. So let's replace citizens, eligible voters, every American, all of those. We're just going to flip that right over to Americans and voters. So when we qualify voter with a word like eligible, again, we're reinforcing that right-wing frame, suggesting that there are ineligible voters who cast illegal ballots. Now, because our elections are conducted properly, people who are voting are eligible voters, so we should just say voters. And then when we're talking about the broad pool of people who are eligible to vote but may or may not be participating, we're best served most of the time simply by saying Americans without any qualifier. This also extends to not using all or every American because that also raises the question of ineligible people voting. The second one under obstacles to voting, voter suppression and fighting voter suppression. Those are also something that we want to move away from into deliberate barriers to voting, denying our freedom to vote, protecting our freedom to vote, et cetera, things like that. Because voter suppression is a phrase that is unfortunately not understood by very many people. They think of it as, poll taxes or literacy tests, and now it's not necessarily like that anymore. We still have voter suppression, it just looks different. Fewer polling centers, lack of access to mail-in voting in certain areas, that's all sort of the new voter suppression. But further, for conflicted voters, they're susceptible to the notion that there are votes that we should suppress. Those are that are purportedly cast illegally. So we can make this issue more concrete for our audiences by naming how certain politicians erect deliberate barriers to voting. And we can render it more broadly off-putting by making the harm seem more widely felt. This has to do with all of us, making all of our, protecting all of our freedom to vote. And then finally, when we talk about uniform standards or minimum standards, we just want to flip that to national standards for voting access. Now, when we frame, we want to frame these issues in terms of broader things that they care about. And again, this is all focused specifically on voting, but I think it's really helpful in a number of contexts. So mail-in voting will be different. If you're talking to someone in Arizona, 80% of our state votes by mail. We love our mail-in voting in Arizona. And the laws that our legislature is enacting, it's already changed it, even from what we've seen in the last election. So that's something we can highlight. Hey, this system that you love, that you used for decades, it's going to change. Then we have some really broadly popular concepts: keeping corporate money out of politics, rooting out corruption, and reducing partisan gerrymandering. Those are things that you can always lean into because they tend to be very, very popular. But whenever you're talking with someone, you want to define the stakes and do so in a way that makes it very, very personal. Make the reader, if you're writing a letter to the editor, or the voter, if you're talking to someone, a family member, you need to make them the protagonist of the story. And to do that, you're really pushing on this idea that we need you. We need you in this fight. We need every single one of us. You specifically, you're special and you have a voice in this. We really want to bring people in. And if that messaging sounds familiar, it should, because good messaging is good messaging, whether it's 1916 or 2021. So that's just something that I like to highlight there. And as we define the stakes, we want to really make it relevant to their lives or the lives of the people that they care about. So help them see themselves in these scenarios. So like examples, if we're talking about voting, if we're changing mail-in voting, we're going to make it harder for our military members to vote. And that's the last thing that many people want. Similarly, seniors. An example of this would be one of the things that they proposed at the legislature this year was shortening the cure window that you have after the election to correct any issues with your signatures. Well, seniors, if you are suffering from Parkinson's or you've just gotten older, have less muscle control, your signature might look different now than it did when you signed your driver's license. You should have time to be able to verify that that's your ballot. We shouldn't do away with that voting window. So that's, or that cure window, I apologize. So again, we want to really make it relevant to either themselves or people that they care about. Similarly, rural communities, many of these laws make it difficult for our neighbors in outlying counties to vote, and college students as well. And what I say about this, to help them see themselves in these scenarios, you really want to paint a picture. You want to be the ghost of Christmas future. So really, really show them voting is going to look different, and this is how it will impact these different groups or you, yourself, et cetera, but really, really paint a vivid picture. And then something that's always helpful to touch back on, and again, this is in our letters to the editor hub, so I won't spend too much time on it, is just letting them know this is what the state legislature does. It governs so much of our day-to-day lives that I think people don't always necessarily realize it does as much as it actually does. So I'm going to link back to that slide in just a minute. But in addition to misinformation and disinformation, one of the biggest threats to democracy is cynicism. So I'm sure you have all heard things like this: my vote doesn't matter, all politicians are corrupt, and I'm not really political. And this is where I go back to that state legislature 101 slide, is because even if you think you're not political or that it doesn't matter, I guarantee that you care about at least one thing on that list. And as far as all politicians are corrupt, if you have that idea, maybe, but democracy dies in darkness, right? So if we're engaged and paying attention, then we can root out that corruption. But also, we really want to share and validate. And this is where the empathetic listening comes in, because this is our most powerful way, I think, to connect with folks. So if you're talking about voting, share a personal story about casting a ballot. And in this regard, both positive and negative experiences are useful. And then validate the fact that people do have complicated feelings about voting. For many, it's stressful, it's confusing, it's just not a priority for them. They don't see the link to their day-to-day lives. And then also understanding that some communities and populations have been intentionally excluded from this process, or they're dealing with those additional barriers that have been erected. So when we share and validate, here are some ways to do that. I never really thought much about voting. I'd vote if I remembered, but it wasn't a priority. That all changed when? And you tell your story. I've had trouble casting my ballot, and then you tell that. It made me feel anxious and exasperated. I want politicians to focus on making voting more accessible. When I used to vote at the polls, I always felt rushed. Besides, I hated standing in line. I voted by mail in 2020, and I loved it. I found it was much easier to research the candidates and really take my time with the ballot. And then finally, when every polling location within 20 miles of my home closed, it was so discouraging. Nonetheless, I won't let corrupt politicians silence my voice and restrict my freedom to vote. So as I wrap up here, I just want to highlight that we want to sell the brownie and not the recipe. And this comes from the Democracy Rising briefing, which again, I'll put that link in the chat. But when you go to the store and you're buying a box of brownies, you don't look at the back to see all of the ingredients. What they sell you on is those beautiful, chewy, delicious fudge brownies on the cover. So when we're talking about these things, we want to talk about what they mean for people's lives, not necessarily the policy minutia of it. And that's where we really lean into those shared values and how this will make things better for everyone. So I'm going to skip that slide in the interest of time. Here's all of our information. I will put that in the chat. And with that, I will stop my share and answer any questions.
Wow. That's a lot of information. That was wonderful, Laura. That was just terrific. Thank you. You hardly even paused. I mean, that was a flawless presentation. Do we have any questions or anything you'd like to say to Laura or ask? Silent group here today. You can either raise your hand or just, it's a small group, just speak out. Kathy, I see you.
I just look forward to that kind of leadership and that kind of communication in office. So
no kidding, no kidding.
Yes.
Thank
Kathy?
you.
I just wanted to say that, you know, I've had a similar training to this a while ago by somebody from ADP actually. And the thing that I brought away from it for me is that I can practice these techniques with my husband. You know, I want him to do a particular thing, and you can use those same steps to get him, you know, to get him to see why I, you know, what it is I am trying to convey to him in a positive way, so he'll listen to it. So I think it's something that you practice and you get better and better at it. It takes a long time. It's you know, maybe a bit intimidating when you first think about doing it. I've got a long ways to go to get to where I want to be on it, but practice makes perfect kind of thing on it. I think the more you practice, the better you get.
I'd like to share a little about that. I have been, as many of you know, I've been working on the Stop Dark Money or Outlaw Dirty Money petition in Arizona for a number of years now. I'm going over 3 years. And of course, I'm outside talking to everybody that comes by, and I'm not asking them what their party is. Of course, sometimes it's obvious because they've got a MAGA hat on or something. But what I've learned to do is find common language and look people in the eye and not come at them, you know, in a combative way, but in a loving, caring manner that's sincere. And people recognize when you are sincere and when you know, are authentic, as opposed to, you know, when you're in a, you know, a mode to battle. And it really makes a huge difference. I get all these Republicans signing this petition saying, well, of course, we know none of the Democrats will sign this. And then the Democrats say, well, we know none of the Republicans will sign this. So anyway, it's really important that we are sincere in our interactions. I just wanted to say, and thank you for the amazing presentation. I'm going to look at it over and over.
Yeah, I would say that I totally agree with everything both of you shared about practicing and really how we approach this. I would say go into every conversation with curiosity. It's really hard even for me sometimes when someone's extolling a point that I know is wrong or that is very diametrically opposed to my values. But a lot of times if you just sort of set your own emotions aside, which is very hard to do, and just keep asking them questions. Oh, well, that's interesting. Why do you feel that way? Can you explain that to me a little bit more? Oh, I haven't heard that yet. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? A lot of times you can get to the root of what their issue is. So for example, someone who's really hard over on gun rights, maybe their issue is that they were once the victim of a violent crime and this is a feeling of safety and security for them. Well, once you know that their actual issue is not necessarily the Second Amendment, it's safety, you can talk about that. That may, you know, get us out of that hot button issue of guns. So if there's one thing to take away, I would just say be curious when we're talking to people who don't necessarily agree with us and lean into those shared values.
I have to admit that after so many years social media, I think I've seen the principles that you talked about develop, quite frankly, and my own responses to them kind of went along with your recommendations of what to embrace and replace, kind of thing, because when you were your replacement list, you realized you were supporting the other side, and it often, and I'm talking going back to Yahoo chat rooms, and then of course Facebook, 10 or 12 years or 11 years on Facebook, the progress from getting in these horrible, never-ending or upsetting discussions to somewhere where you're just sharing information. In my case, I was a longtime teacher, and so people come to my social media expecting to be and also expecting a certain perspective, and they expect truth. So I've been trying for a long time. Every once in a while I screw up, but most of the time, putting both of these discussions together today, most of the time I don't share misinformation, and they get what they came for, and I like to feel that it's not exactly an influencer, but at least some good information is going where it's necessary. And I want to say this: some of my Sedona friends, we do get crap. I get crap for preaching to the choir, to use the shorthand. But as both of these speakers highlighted today, preaching to the choir is not a bad thing. There's lots of benefit that comes from reminding and clarifying and all the things that we've heard this morning. Thank you.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that, Michael. It's just, I would say, be intentional about when you're preaching to the choir. Just ask yourself, well, what's the goal here? Is this a good use of my time? And a lot of times it is. If you're informing them about an issue that they don't know about, hey, come to this march, sign up for RTS, all those great things. Then I think that's great.
That was terrific. Jody, do you have anything else you would like to say or address from Laura's presentation?
Oh, funny, I was just typing my goodbye in the chat. I loved it, Laura. I thought that was just fantastic in every way. And I'm a big fan of the work, and I always get confused about there's the Voting Rights Lab, and then there's all the other organizations that are sharing the messages every week, but I listen whenever I can. So I would just say there's an awful lot of overlap in what we're doing, and that when we develop the best practices in creating these truth sandwiches that I've been talking about, they're heavily informed by the work of Lakov and Jay Rosen, and then and a lot of the people and Laura's group. So that's all. I just think messaging is really important, and I thought it was a wonderful presentation that I'm going to come back to.
I'd say the same about Jody's. This was a joy this morning, and it was just a real delight to be here. So thank you, Ellen, so much for the invitation.
Yeah. You're more than welcome. This was terrific, as we suspected it would be.
Right, I'm going to jump off and say goodbye, and thanks to everybody.
Okay, thanks, Jody. Kathy, do you want to wind things up?
I was following my own practice of being muted, so I had to remember. I do want to thank Jody and Laura for both being here. So informational. We've gained so much from your presentations, and we'll go back, as Kat said, and look at the stuff over and over again to try to incorporate it into our practice. So thank you so much for being here. Ellen, thank you so much for a great program. It was a fabulous program this morning, and please share it with your friends. It will come out in email if you're on our email list. Really easy way. You just forward it to the people that you know that weren't here today, so we can spread this message. I did want to say we have Dusty with us today. Is she still here? She probably is, right? There she is. Happy birthday, Dusty.
Oh. I had to leave.
Yeah.
Thank you. I had to leave some of the presentation because my son called me on the phone, And, you know, you have to talk to your son.
Oh, yeah, on your birthday.
And so I missed some of her. I'm disappointed, but
Well,
thank
go
you
back
very
and
much.
watch it again when you get the email.
Okay, I
You
will.
can
Thank
fast
you.
forward it too, once you have the email.
And you know, and that's, if we can print it all out, that would be good for in the office for the volunteers to, in case somebody comes in, and they want to, which they have done, they want to talk to us, you know, and we have something to reply to them.
Oh, I'll have Linda forward it to all the office staff. That's a really good idea. The recording, you know, that would be great. Yeah. So thank you all for coming. It's been a wonderful meeting. You know, sometimes this stuff gets a little stressful. It does in my life, and I need to escape from the politics for a while. So please go outside. It's a beautiful, wonderful fall day. Breathe the fresh air, listen to the birds chirping, and, you know, have some time just to
have a happy birthday.
Yeah, and a happy birthday for Dusty. You do that in particular. All right. Thank you so much. We'll see you all in January. Have a wonderful holiday season.
Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.